The title of this evening is Myths and Legends, and the subtitle is King Arthur, St. Nicholas, and Jesus of Nazareth. Is there any difference between these figures? Is there any historical evidence that suggests that Jesus Christ existed? Now, Professor Gary Habermas is the author of, or co-author of over 30 books and 100 articles. In the last 12 years, he has given over 1,500 lectures in over 100 universities, seminaries, and colleges. Dr. Habermas acts as a distinguished research professor and chair in the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, where he's taught for the past 26 years. And he joins us this evening, as he says, from Virginia, USA. So over to Gary.
Thank you very much. Well, it's hard to see what you can pack in 30 minutes, but let me do it this way. Let me begin with that intriguing topic, King Arthur. And, you know, I could list a lot of people that go in that category. And what do we know and not know about these people of the past? Well, you know, Arthur's an interesting comparison, because the books, the historical books on Arthur, King Arthur, are the early references are very, very few, very, very far between. The major ones are Middle Ages, medieval, and there's only a few references spread out over hundreds of years. And even the ones we have are late. Let me use another example. Alexander the Great. Let me use another secular one and one religious one. Alexander the Great had many major works written by him. We assume they're major. The problem is we don't have any of the early ones. Some of them were eyewitnesses. We don't have them. The earliest biography is almost 300 years after Alexander, and the major biographies of Alexander are by Arrian and Plutarch, writing 425 to 450 years later after Alexander. And they're the major ones. I'm not picking straw man or bad examples. They're the best ones. And when you think about it, we're 40 to 45% of the way toward a millennium after Alexander. I mean, that's a long time. We talk about Alexander like we're sure about everything. Oh yeah, he did this, he did that, he conquered the world, he moved from Macedon east, he went through Persia, went all the way over to India, got sick and died at a very young age. And we all know that story. All right, you say, well, okay, how are we doing on religious figures? Horribly. I mean, Alexander is generally a better example at plus 300 for the first one and 4 to 450 for the rest of them. He's a good example. I have a Buddhist scholar, actually British, but he's a Buddhist scholar, PhD, and he starts a book on the key Buddhist scriptures. And he starts his book like this. He says, I believe on the very first page, he says, for my Christian readers, we don't have what you have. You have the words of your Lord. We don't. You have the words of those who studied under your Lord. We don't. You have the words of the continuing traditions under those who studied under your Lord. We don't. Matter of fact, he said, we don't even know what Buddha taught. And then he said, in this book, where I'm trying to bring together the best sources, the major sources in this book are 600 to 800 years after Buddha died. One article in a historical journal on the birth of Buddha surveyed Japanese sources that couldn't agree on the birth of Buddha within 2,000 years. So some of the data are very, very iffy, and yet we say Buddha did this, Buddha did that, Buddha taught this. And here this major Buddhist scholar saying we don't know even what school of thought he belonged to. Now, I'm not trying to say that we know all there is about Christianity or everybody agrees on Jesus. I'm not saying that. But there's an amazing amount of agreement from very, very early dates about the key things in Jesus' life. All right, well, what do key things indicate? Well, I would think there are several epochs in Jesus' life, the historical Jesus, where we would do well to know that they're reported in multiple sources that are fairly early. John Dominic Crossan, the Irish scholar who's been in the States mostly the last few decades, but the Irish scholar says in his book, Historical Jesus, he gives a list in the back of multiple references, whether they're historical or not. What about early references? And he lists pages and pages and pages of references relative to Jesus' life with single-spaced little footnotes about what we have on each of these. And in the earliest phase, with sources that report the key things of Jesus' life, he lists the crucifixion, the teaching that there was a resurrection, the teaching that the resurrected Jesus appeared. In other words, you have the event of the resurrection, which is not described in the New Testament, but just the fact of the New Testament records the fact of the resurrection. And then many references to appearances of Jesus. This is John Dominic Crossan. And we don't talk about this much, but he even says there's multiple references for the virginal conception of Jesus. Now, he doesn't believe in the miraculous things here, so I guess that makes him an even better witness in the sense that he doesn't have a religious axe to grind. But those are some early sources. Okay, now in our country, the best-known skeptic in North America, best-known New Testament skeptic, an atheist New Testament scholar, is Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman, in a book called The Jesus Exist, where he argues against the Jesus mythers, which he says he gets a little bothered with the Jesus myth people. And he says, you folks who think Jesus doesn't live, you think Jesus never lived, how come you have almost no scholars among you, almost nobody with scholarly credentials in related fields, classics, ancient history, New Testament, theology, maybe some philosophers, who knows? There's virtually no one among you with doctorates and so on in those areas. And he says, none of you folks, mythicists, none of even your better trained folks, of which there's a few, they don't teach in accredited universities, seminaries, or colleges. So he says, you don't have a very good basis. He said, now let's talk about why your folks aren't in colleges and why people don't say Jesus is a myth. Now, again, he's an atheistic New Testament scholar, and he starts giving statistics. And here's one of my favorites. If we agree that in the New Testament, the key things regarding the gospel are the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. And by resurrection, I'm speaking here of the appearances, because that's how we know there was a resurrection. Because if he died and he was seen afterwards, something's going on. So, deity, death, resurrection. Now, here's Bart Ehrman, atheist New Testament scholar, and he lists 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years. Now, that's his timeline. He says, I'll take sources for the first 100 years. Now, a lot of people will take sources further than that, historical sources. They'll say, oh, let's go 150 years from Jesus. And that last 50 years, you pick up a slew. But Bart Ehrman says, let's just do 100 after the birth of Jesus, crucifixion of Jesus. And he says we have 15 independent sources. A number of them are non-Christian, and a number of them are not even in the New Testament. So, he's saying those of you who say you can't count New Testament sources, and he goes on to say that, well, that's a joke. You can count New Testament sources if they're accredited. But he says a number of these sources are not in the New Testament, and none of them are not Christian. He also says, although he rejects it, like Crossan, but Ehrman says that the earliest Christians coming out of the gate, we have this view that John, the Gospel of John, is the first time this high Christology is taught, and that's about plus 65 years after the crucifixion. So if the crucifixion is about 30 AD, if the Gospel of John is about 95 AD, That's about 65 years. And that people, the old view, Richard Bauckham, James D.G. Dunn, a couple great British scholars who said that this used to be their view. They told me that personally, that this used to be their view, that the big unpacking Christology happened about the time of John. Now they flip-flop. They don't hold that view anymore. And they hold this view that Bart Ehrman, I'll use him to spell out here. He says the earliest Christians taught that Jesus was God. At least some early Christians taught that Jesus was God, and so much so, you say, what's the definition of God? I mean, come on, he's a man. What's the definition of being God? Well, Ehrman says the earliest Christians taught that he was uncreated and existed from eternity past. That's a pretty high view of deity. In fact, Richard Bauckham, and he's not the first one to say this, but Richard Bauckham cites a line that's popular with some Oxford folks. And the line is, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. Think about that. Not the highest Christology is John's Christology, and by the way, it's a bunch of myth. I mean, compare that statement to the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. And you got to kind of be ready for this. Bart Ehrman says these early views on the deity of Christ are found within a year or two of the cross, within a year or two of crucifixion. This early thing is maybe the most radical step that's happened in the last decade or so. So do we know a lot about Jesus? Right. Not only do we have a lot of sources, say Ehrman's 15 on the crucifixion compared to no works on Alexander before about 300, Buddha's 600 to 800, and I could give other sources that are way, way longer than that with major religious and historical figures. But we have the teaching of. Now, a lot of these folks don't say that these events actually occurred. Crossan doesn't think Jesus was raised. Ehrman doesn't think he was raised. I mentioned the virginal conception. Crossan said it's attested early, but he doesn't think it actually happened. So these are two people, Crossan and Ehrman, who don't take the supernatural events, but believe they were reported very early. Okay, so there's an idea. There's a little introduction for us on Jesus compared to Arthur, briefly, Alexander, Buddha, and we could do other figures if somebody wants to pursue those later, like Zoroaster, Krishna, Hinduism. Other sources don't measure up very well. It's just not, they're kind of not in the ballpark. Now, I mean, not in the ballpark. Okay, let me give you an example of not in the ballpark. The earliest copy that I understand, I'm not a Hindu scholar, but I mean, I can read, and I understand the earliest source we have for Krishna, if he lived. And you say, well, yeah, if he lived. A lot of people say Jesus didn't live. No, I've got a source that says, can be wrong, but a Hindu source that says most Hindu scholars think Krishna never lived. Okay, be that as it may. If he did live in the century in which he's usually thought to live, the earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita is 4,200 years later. 4,200 years later. All right, let's move to the data for the resurrection. I said a moment ago, and we already kind of got into it, I said the key here, the revolution, is how early this Christology is, how early the life of Jesus is. How about the appearances? Surely these folks don't agree that the appearances reported that early, do they? All right. James D.G. Dunn of Durham, unfortunately just passed away a very short time ago, but James D.G. Dunn is influential as any historical Jesus scholar today. He says in his big book, Remembering Jesus, he states that the accounts of the appearances began circulating as creeds, early creedal statements that are contained later, mostly in Paul, but elsewhere throughout the New Testament and elsewhere beyond the New Testament. He says that the creedal report of the resurrection probably circulated within months of the event. Months of the event. Larry Hurtado, almost as well known as Bauckham and Dunn. I think Larry just passed away too, just a while back before Dunn did. And I think he's in America, not sure, but for years he was the head of one of the religion departments at Edinburgh. And Larry Hurtado said days after the resurrection appearances, they are reported. And Gerd Ludemann, the German, I've heard him called an atheist. I don't think I've seen him say that about himself, like Ehrman does, but I've seen him called an atheist New Testament German scholar, Bart Ehrman. I'm sorry, Gerd Ludemann. He says that the preaching of the resurrection appearances happened immediately after the events in question. So here you've got Ludemann, Ehrman, Jimmy Dunn, and now Jimmy believed in those events. Jimmy Dunn believed in those events, but Ehrman and Ludemann do not. And yet all three, put Bauckham in there, there's four, and many others, they date the proclamation from immediately after the events. And if we have this early data for the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus at that early date, I think it's just amazing. By the way, I hope I'm not saying anything silly here, but often when I'm lecturing in England, people wonder what in the world, what does my word deity mean? I think it's probably an American pronunciation. Do you folks say deity? Is that very common? It is? Okay. Let me say that just so I'm not trying to just get pronunciation down here. I just want us all on the same page. So if you said deity, death, resurrection, that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the earliest Christology is the highest Christology? Yes. Really? Including the cross? Absolutely. They thought they proclaimed him as God and existing from time past before he was born we celebrated Christmas. Yes. And we have appearances. Yes. Reported days later. Yes. Who says this right now? Basically everybody who's researched it. Oh, do they all report this? Yes. Non-Christians included? Yes. Do they have early sources? Yes. Many? Or just one or two? Many. What would many be? Let's say at least a dozen. This is an amazing turn of events. Now, you have to wade in there and talk about whether you think these things are true and whether you think these things happened or not. And this big 5,200 page book I'm working on, it's not totally on history, but it's largely on unraveling these things. The first volume, which I hope is going to be out sometime in my lifetime, it's huge, 7 years worth, unbelievable amount of work. But the first volume on just the evidence, and I'm not doing deity in the first volume. I'm only doing crucifixion and resurrection appearances. That first volume is approximately 1,500 manuscript pages. 1,500 manuscript pages of data. And there's virtually no argument from these skeptics that these things were taught. Now, you can say, well, on what grounds do they disagree? They must make up naturalistic theories, right? They must say, here's how I define a naturalistic theory. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank. That's a naturalistic theory. You can fill it in with anything you want. Actually, almost no specialists go there anymore, whether they are believing or atheist New Testament scholars, Jewish New Testament scholars. There's a number of those, a number of Jewish, non-Christian Jewish New Testament scholars. They don't make up the theories. In fact, another, until he passed away, he was Eastern European, but Geza Vermesh was at Oxford for many years. and he was professor of Jewish history at Oxford. And he wrote a little book on resurrection shortly before he passed away. And he calls himself an agnostic, and he doesn't really come down on anything, but he's got a brief chapter explaining that all these fill in the blanks are ridiculous. He says they're useless. Pinchas Lapid, he's a PhD, a German PhD New Testament, Jewish New Testament scholar. And he says Jesus was raised from the dead. It's a very famous book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish Perspective, from the early 80s. And he says Jesus was raised from the dead. And then he goes on to say why he doesn't think he's the Messiah. But interestingly enough, he argues, if I understand his argument, he doesn't give a lot of details. He takes a popular Jewish view, which says that Jesus is the Gentile Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah for all non-Jews in the world. So, you look at that percentage-wise, that makes Jesus the Messiah for virtually everybody. And that's according to the Jewish New Testament scholar with the PhD New Testament from, I believe, Tübingen in Germany. So things are not true. I want to make this clear. Things are not true because scholars say they are. It helps that many of these scholars are very far from believing these things, but it's just not that. Here's what you have to ask. What's the step before? Why do they concede this? The step before is the data that are on which these things are allowed. And some of you may know, to kind of get me to the end of the first half hour here, I use an argument that I call the minimal facts argument. And let me repeat this again. It's not my argument, but it's this kind of a move that brings all these skeptics. That's why they agree with this data. And and the reason these data lead to the beliefs I've been talking about is because you can take facts which the most skeptical scholars agree. In fact, I argue, I use 6 of them. I take a larger list of 12, cut them in half, because I don't need all of them. I have way more than I need. In fact, you can start with 20 and go down to 12 and go down to 6, and I use 6. And about 90% of scholars today will accept these 6. And these 6 are themselves evidenced if you counted every little point that backed these 6 up. There are over 100 separate data points backing up these 6. Plus, I'll throw a 7th one in there, the empty tomb, which isn't agreed to by, it's pretty highly agreed to, like about 70% of scholars today. But the other ones are in the 90s. And the empty tomb's not one of my 6. So taking those 6 plus the empty tomb, I have over 100 data points that back those up. So with 6 facts, let me we've been talking about them. Let me just go ahead and define them for you real quickly. The 6 I use. Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after, his followers had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Thirdly, these experiences were reported very, very early. Again, Jimmy Dunn, Ludeman, Ehrman, within days, and at max a year to 2 years, Bart Ehrman. Reported immediately. So we have crucifixion, experiences of the risen Jesus, reported immediately. Fourth, their lives are transformed. Now, in today's world, people's lives are transformed for a lot of reasons, and people often die for those reasons. I have no doubt that we can find atheistic communists who died for communism. I don't doubt it. Most things that people are really committed to are either religious or political, or they're both. But they're keys. And people will die for things they think are keys and worth basing their lives on. But here's the difference with the disciples with that point of transformation. The difference is everybody else dies for what they think is true, a political view. Um, Today, missionaries may die for the belief that Jesus died for our sins according to the scriptures. They could, but they weren't there. They didn't see it. They're reporting other data. The difference with those who were willing to die in the first century is that they were witnesses. They died for what they would say they saw, which is much more solid than somebody today dying for what they saw 2,000 years ago. So only today do we have cases in religion of people being transformed by resurrection appearances immediately. And then the last two, we haven't mentioned these names yet, but they're very well known to you. James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, the apostle, both become believers because they thought they saw the risen Jesus. Those six: crucifixion, appearances, immediate proclamation, transformation because of those experiences, and sometimes leading to death. And then James and Paul, two skeptics who become Christians and frankly turn the world upside down. So those are the facts. I started with the large agreement because I could start with the facts and people could say, yeah, everybody says that, but nobody gives it to you except you Christians. Well, that's not true. It's granted by, here's the requirement. I'm only talking about specialists. I don't care how liberal, atheist, Jewish, non-Christian, I don't care. As long as they're scholars in relevant fields, they can speak. And they grant this to probably a 90-something percentile group. And on that basis, we can conclude that Jesus is deity or deity, died on the cross for our sins. The for our sins part is theological, but died by crucifixion, rose from the dead, appeared, and that if all we know, I'll end with this sentence, if all we know about Christianity is that those three are true, deity, death, resurrection, if that's all we know, we may not be able to answer many other questions, but Christianity follows. Christianity follows from deity, death, resurrection, appearances, and it's loaded with data and agreement.
Let's go through some questions then. So the first question for you this evening, what date would you give for the gospel documents in their written form? So the gospel documents, what date would you give for them in their written form? And what do you consider to be the earliest New Testament document?
Okay. I would probably date the Gospels a little bit earlier than the status quo, but the status quo is to put Mark at about 70. Now here's the critical dating. Mark at about 70, Matthew at about 80, Luke at 85, and John about 95. The earliest New Testament document is probably 1 Thessalonians about 50 AD or plus 20 after the cross.
Okay, and so you said that's the critical dating. And you said that you wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Where would you place those documents?
Well, okay, now there are some outliers among the critics. There are some, for example, James Crossley, and a couple people in Britain put Mark back at about 40, believe it or not. And both of the ones I have in mind, Morris Casey and James Crossley, are both agnostics, and they put it at 40. But that's and by the way, Casey puts Matthew at about 50. So, but that's really strange. I think most people. A friend of mine, Mike Lacona, worked with somebody just recently, and I think he said there are a few more people who put Mark at just slightly before 70 than those who put Mark after 70. Matthew and Luke about 80, 85, and about everybody puts John about 95. Yeah, and everybody, as far as I know, I mean, I think it's pretty general. of the First Thessalonians date about 50.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so another question on the earliest reports. So the earliest reports, the question is the earliest reports within months of the resurrection, but which reports are they? And what are you referring to when you say the earliest reports within months of the resurrection?
So,
Does
okay,
it?
so am I on the right track on your question if I say, okay, if the earliest book is First Thessalonians and 50, and that's plus 20, what sources am I referring to that go all the way back to the cross and just afterwards, right?
Yeah.
Okay. This is the most exciting single area of research in the last few decades. In the New Testament, there are a bunch of dozens of creedal texts. Now, when we say creed, we think of Nicaea, Constantinople, Chalcedon, and so on, and that's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Creeds are oral testimonies that were repeated in such a way as to be memorized. Okay, here's Bart Ehrman, again, the North American New Testament atheist. Ehrman says most of the creeds Paul cites, he says maybe all of them, maybe every one he cites, comes from Jerusalem. Many of them, if not most of them, are pre-Pauline conversion. Now, if you put the conversion of Paul at plus 2 or 3, which most scholars do, Paul's conversion is plus 2 or 3. These early creeds, for example, the best known one is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I gave you what I was given. Paul says the same thing a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 11. I gave you what I gave you what I received from the Lord about the Lord's Supper. Okay. Ehrman says all of them probably came from Jerusalem, were probably pre-Pauline conversion. So these data were out there before Paul's conversion. Paul probably knew it before his conversion, but didn't buy it. And then Ehrman also says Paul probably got some of these from the apostles themselves, especially when they went to Jerusalem at about plus 5. You can add that up and get the 5 years. I can do it if you want, but Paul goes to Jerusalem at about plus 5, i.e. 35 AD, and he spends 15 days with Peter and James. Later he goes back, still before First Thessalonians, and Peter, James, and John are there. So the incredible thing here is that, as I called them, the big four are all together. By far the most influential early Christians would be Peter and John, 2 of the 12, and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. So that's 4 apostles, four persons called apostles. But the data, these reports on deity, death, resurrection, are in these creedal statements. And you think, well, great. Let's just say they're early, but it sounds like hearsay to me. That would be a prominent critique. Sounds like hearsay. And even Bart Ehrman says, how can they be hearsay? When Paul goes to Jerusalem at plus 5, spends 15 days with Peter and James, had to be discussing this stuff. When he goes back, he said they were specifically discussing it, the gospel. And he says, so it can't be hearsay if Paul got it from them, and they're the eyewitnesses, and they're openly reporting it then. You also have the Acts, a huge category. They're a type of creed, but they're a little different species. The Acts sermon summaries. They're in Acts chapters 1 through 5, 10, 13. Those are the main ones. Acts 1 through 5, 10, not the whole chapter, but in those chapters. Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13. The first ones up through 10 are Petrine. 13 is Pauline. Sometimes 17 is put in there. That's Pauline. That's when he goes to Areopagus. So these are oral creeds that probably came from the apostles in Jerusalem, were given to Paul. Paul probably knew them before he became a Christian. He becomes a Christian, and starting in 1 Thessalonians in 50 AD and throughout his epistles, he's unpacking these creeds. He's not the only one that does it. But anyway, those are the major sources that are between 30 and 35 AD. And critics, amazingly, they give credence to them, all because, like Ehrman says, all because Paul goes to Jerusalem and ascertains these things. Now, I'll take one step further. Let's see if we can outcritic the critics. What if they say, well, we don't know they actually had the creeds back 30 to 35, but they had the content because we have the report of their preaching. And I would say everybody thinks we have the creeds, but it's irrelevant. It's a moot point. We have the content of the deity or deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. You have that. And as I often like to say it, you're on the yellow brick road to the celestial city, you know, the emerald city of Oz, only the heavenly city. It's like Pilgrim's Progress, right? You're on the road going toward the city. You don't have to know that's the creeds. Everybody thinks it's that, but you don't have to, it doesn't have to be the creeds. It's the content in the creeds that we want. And that definitely goes back to the cross itself. That's the one I was citing when I said Dunn, Ludeman, Hurtado, Bauckham, Bart Ehrman, etc. All the big hitters.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been quite a few questions about this, these sort of early divine reports and that sort of thing. Do you know of any popular level works which talk about these in a bit more detail?
I did it again, didn't I?
Let's have a look. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, brilliant.
I put my volume up, but when I put my volume up, my picture left the screen.
Oh, you're still with us. Don't worry. We can still see you. Yeah.
All right, good enough. Let me just try this. How's that work? Okay. All right. Ben, your question was what? I'm sorry.
Don't worry. Do you know of any popular level works which discuss early Christology or?
Yeah, and I don't know how popular they are, but they're written popularly.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, if you give me 5 seconds, I'll grab a few and hold them up for you because you'll probably be familiar with them.
Sure. While he's doing that, just to say as well, another little plug that if you go to www.genexis.org/reading, then there's some books on there, some of which Gary has recommended for this session, others of which for the other sessions, but you can have a look on there. I'm not sure if these will appear, but there's something as well.
Here's the best ones. Let me tell you a little story. Very brief. I was lecturing in Cambridge a number of years ago at Tyndale House. You folks probably know Tyndale House. And they have a semicircular kind of a saucer-shaped room. And they asked me to give a 2-hour lecture on Jesus, miracles, and the resurrection from Friedrich Schleiermacher to date. So that's 200 years. What do we know about history? So I'm starting to do this lecture. I'm doing this timeline that I mark off, mostly on 30 to 35 AD. And guess what? 10 minutes after I started talking, Richard Bauckham walks in the room and sits down. And I thought, oh, man. Now, I'd just been with him a month or two before that. But still, I mean, Richard Bauckham's not to be taken lightly, from Cambridge and St. Andrews and so on. And he sat down and I finished my lecture. And in the whole room, there were about 35 people, and they were all either professors or doctoral students at Cambridge. And when it was over, some of them came up and asked me some questions. A bunch of them gathered around Richard. And when it was over, I went up to him and I said, well, I took your name in vain during the timeline here. Did I say it right? I mean, do you agree with all this? The stuff that I identified as, Ludeman, Hurtado, Dunn, Bauckham, and so on. And he said, yep, you got it right. And I said, Richard, you're being very kind. How could I have done better? What do you think? And he said, okay, one thing. He said, you could have mentioned a book by Oscar Cullmann called The Earliest Christian Confessions, which came out in French, German, and English all about the same time, and all in the 40s, early to later 40s. And I kind of chuckled, and I said, Richard, you're totally right. That's a great book. I said I gave the same lecture 4 days ago at Oxford University, and I spent about 10 minutes of the lecture on that book. I just left it out today. He said, yeah, well, that's good. I'd mentioned that book. Okay, let me tell you, here's the book right here. It just came out in a new edition. My doctoral students tell me that when they tried to buy this book for years, it was unavailable. And when it was on Google or Amazon, it cost over $100. It's out right now with Whiffen Stock, reprinted, American publisher. And notice they put my name on the front of it. We asked for this book to be republished. And so my grad assistant and I wrote a little forward for it, but it's not us. I mean, this is the book, and the copyright date is the English edition is 1949, and the German and French predated it. But this is it. And last time I asked my students, it's only $10, something like that. $10.
Wow.
So this is the main book, but that's not the form it was in. Okay. Here's Arrival by another British scholar, The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments by C.H. Dodd of Cambridge. Now, this book is 36 from Hodder and Stoughton of London. I believe 36, yes. And Baker Books in the U.S. brought it out again, if you're looking for a used copy, in 1980. But it's out of print with everybody. We tried to bring this one out again, and the person who holds the rights to one of the family members, he's pretty elderly, and he didn't respond. They were going to bring this book out too, but I don't know that it's anywhere. So you probably have to get this in a used version. Apostolic Preaching's Developments. It's one of the best books on the Acts sermon summaries, 1 through 5, 10, 13. This is probably the best book of all. And although it was a doctoral dissertation at Princeton under the famous Bruce Metzger, New Testament scholar, it's a doctoral dissertation, but it's absolutely consumable. I mean, it's a great book. Vernon Neufeld, Neufeld, and it's called the same thing as Kuhlman, The Earliest Christian Confessions. And we wanted to bring this one out with Whiffen Stock because it's out of print. When Brill heard that we wanted to bring it out, they said, no, we're going to bring it out. Okay, good. That's fine. And they brought out a new edition. You can get a copy of this hardcover for $25. So this is excellent. This is a systematic treatment of the creeds and why they're historical. This is Dodd and Kuhlman. They're scholarly, but they're a little more popular than this one. But I think they can all be read by intelligent lay people who are up on this stuff. You don't have to have a PhD. I'd say those are the best places to start. Sorry for my long answer, but those are the best books.
That's really helpful, Gary. Thank you. I'm sure people will enjoy getting their hands on that. And I'm sure I'm really thankful that you've been able to join us this evening. There's one other question that I'd just like to ask you, and this one's from me. From your perspective, based on what you said this evening, how does the historical Jesus and the historical resurrection most connect with this idea of there being a creator God? So what evidence is the historical Jesus and the historical resurrection for there being a creator God? How would you answer that question?
The last few words. How does the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection do what?
Help you answer the question, is there a creator God?
Oh. Yes. Well, I'm sorry. I hate to tell you about something I wrote. I've tried not to do that, but I've got a book in case anybody wants to get it. It's called The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, published by American publisher Rowman and Littlefield, 2003, I want to say. And in that book, only the first chapter is kind of the first lecture today. But the rest of the book talks about how from the resurrection, we can move to God, to the deity or deity of Jesus, onto the kingdom. This is the yellow brick road. This is Pilgrim's Progress. This is Middle Earth. This is, Narnia. It's the it's the path to heaven that Jesus asks us to get involved with. And basically, I think the traditional answer, I think, is solid, and almost everybody gives it. If you're going to grant the resurrection, if you're going to grant it, and the evidence is really good, if you're going to grant the resurrection, Jesus couldn't have raised himself. Dead men don't do much. Now, if you go, oh, yes, he could, he was God, well, then that's it. That's the argument. But if you say, okay, dead men don't do much, he said his Father acted upon him. Why would his Father act upon him? There are no other resurrection claims in the world religions, no of the major founders. Nobody else was believed to have been raised from the dead. So if God got involved, if he didn't raise Jesus, then you got a problem coming up with telling us why he didn't raise him, why the evidence isn't where it is. But if he did, it does seem that there can only be one reason. And Jesus said over and over again, my miracles are a sign. Signs point beyond yourselves to somebody and or something else. And the chief teaching of Jesus, even Rudolf Bultmann, the famous German skeptic, said years ago, the center of Jesus' message is the kingdom of God and how to get there. It's the path to the celestial city and what you have to do to stay on the path, to say it metaphorically. And if Jesus was raised from the dead, he couldn't do it. God did it. He's the only one in history of all the teachers. If he confirmed Jesus' message, that is the message. Whenever the New Testament defines the gospel, it's almost always deity, death, resurrection. You've got it. You talk about the kingdom. That's it. But it can be worked out technically. Richard Swinburne has done it. Tom Wright has done it. Mike Lacone has done it. I've done it. Bill Craig's done it. Jimmy Dunn has. All these guys have done this. So I think easily that's the main argument.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's been a delight to have you here at Genexus on the course, and that takes us to the end of the Genexus course 2020. It's been quite a journey. If you're able to give us some feedback on the Genexus course, we'd really value that. And as I say, you can also get yourself a free book by doing that. Also, the book that Gary just mentioned is part of our reading list. And if you open up your chat, you can see that I've put a link there to our reading list, and feel free to go and have a look on that. But all's left is for me to say thank you so much for joining the Genexus course. I really look forward to hopefully meeting again, hopefully in person one day, and have a great evening.
That'd be great to do. We just heard today on the news that two of the largest companies are ready to bring out the antidotes here in just 2-3 weeks. So maybe by next summer it will be gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we're planning some events for next year, and hopefully we may be able to get them happening. So
thank you very much.